of the City Council for January 18th, 5:30 p.m. And City Clerk, can you go ahead and do a roll call vote, please, or roll call, please?
We have Mayor Hasselbrink.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Doby.
Here.
Councilmember Bates.
Here.
Councilmember Turco.
Here.
Councilmember Nafolda.
Here.
Okay, and any action we do tonight will all be done roll call vote because we are remote. So the first item is the public hearing to receive input from the community regarding the redrawing of election district boundaries. Wendy, it looks like this is yours.
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
So tonight is our first public hearing to consider redrawing the district boundaries. The city adopted its current boundaries on July 30th, 2018. Based on new census data from 2020, we now have to reconsider our lines. The city has contracted with NDC to guide us through this process. We have Justin Levitt from NDC with us now. He'll be providing you with a presentation on the process and answering any questions that council may have. I'll turn it over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Mayor Hasselbrink, members of the council, members of the community who are either here tonight or watching this recording. My name is Dr. Justin Levitt with National Demographics, and it's a pleasure to be back here in my hometown because I too am a Los Alamitos resident, so this redistricting really hits close to home. And overall, you know, I know Wendy just kind of gave us an introduction of what we're doing here tonight. And just to kind of add a little bit to what she said, redistricting is required once every 10 years following the decennial census. It doesn't really matter when you switch to district elections, whether it was last year or 2013, you would still have to look at your new district boundaries following that census once every 10 years. This is also been compounded this year with delays in the census data. Normally, we would expect to receive census data in March of the year following the census. However, this year, we did not receive our census data until September. The raw census data came out in August, and the state did a realignment that added about 40 or 50 more additional residents to Los Alamitos. And you know, that means that the process really was delayed in a lot of ways. We chose to wait, in addition, until after the state and county processes were kind of wrapped up in order to really focus on the city and on local redistricting. And so what my presentation will look at is how new laws like the Fair Maps Act have slightly adjusted the process and how districts are drawn. Just to kind of give us an overview that really highlights some of the changes that the Fair Maps Act has. It used to be the requirement that redistricting only needed 1 or 2 public hearings. 1 if you were keeping your same districts, 2 if you were changing your map. Now there is a minimum of 4 public hearings required. 1 of those hearings must be before draft maps are released. 2 of those hearings must be after draft maps are released. We actually have a plan to hold 2 public hearings prior to draft maps being drawn and 3 public hearings following the draft maps being released. This should give us plenty of time over the next 3 months to really focus on the different options, on the different maps prior to this April 17th deadline that the state has set for map adoption. The final map must be adopted at least 7 days, or must be posted at least 7 days prior to adoption. We've kind of worked backwards from that April deadline to space out hearings in a way that gives people time to draw their own maps, to submit comments on the draft maps once they're ready, and give both the council and the community the time to focus in. This is the first of 2 public hearings, the second one on February 7th, that we will solicit input on the draft maps, kind of demo some of the mapping tools and so forth. This really leads us into, in late February and early March, our map hearings to discuss and revise the draft maps. On February 28th and March 7th. We've set some tentative deadlines for submitting maps. This is to give the community an idea of, you know, we need about a week or so to have them prepped and ready to go before the actual meetings. This all leads us to our final adoption at a regular council meeting on March 21st, which does give us about a month leeway if we need to add additional meetings or if the process gets delayed because of Omicron or another COVID related reason. Now, where the law has changed the most from the initial process, from the initial transition to district elections, is probably right here on this slide, the redistricting rules and goals. It used to be the case that we used to balance a lot of criteria, and we had a lot of discretion about prioritizing different criteria. However, the new Fair Maps Act of 2019 really sets this rank ordered list of criteria in terms of the priority we have to place on the different components, the different things we have to take into account looking at districts. On that left-hand column, federal laws, these are the federal rules governing districting and redistricting. Equal population districts have to have more or less the same number of residents. This comes from that 2020 census count. It does include everyone. So it includes non-registered voters, it includes children, it includes anybody counted in Los Alamitos as part of that 2020 census, according to the California prisoner realignment adjusted numbers. We don't have to be perfectly equal. In fact, there are very good reasons, particularly in a city this small, that we might want some deviation or difference in population between the largest and smallest. But we can't exceed a 10% deviation. That means that the difference in population between the largest and smallest districts has to stay under 10%. We also have to take into account the Federal Voting Rights Act. While race cannot be the only factor or even the predominant factor in the creation of a district, we have to consider protected class communities, groups that have historically faced discrimination or barriers to registration and voting, and we can't deliberately divide protected class communities or pack them in such a way that they minimize their influence in a district. In the middle column, this is where we see the bulk of the Fair Maps Act change. These criteria are rank ordered in that we have to take them in this order. So first is contiguity. Contiguity is the idea that all parts of this district must touch each other. So if you can't have a district with, 1 block or 2 blocks over at the west end of the city along the 605, and then another block or 2 on the east end of the city down at Carrier Row. All parts of the district must touch each other. And specifically, this contiguity, they specifically say not just contiguous at a point. There actually has to be a physical connection. You have to be able to walk or drive and stay within that district. Second, undivided neighborhoods and communities of interest. We'll talk more about this on the next slide, but in general, we want to think of this as socioeconomic, geographic, or demographic areas that need to be kept together for the purpose of their fair and effective representation. We do have a communities map of the city. Some of our neighborhoods and communities are bigger than a district, others are smaller. And so we want to discuss what that means over the course of this process. Third, easily identifiable boundaries is the principle that districts should be easy for voters to understand. So to the extent we can follow major roads rather than jogging through neighborhoods, we should strive to do so. And fourth, compactness, which the law specifically defines as not bypassing one group of people to get to a more distant group of people. This is aimed at fingers or hooks or lines that are clearly drawn to bypass one neighborhood to get another neighborhood. And remember, they're rank ordered so that if there is a neighborhood that is not contiguous, if they're not compact, maybe because of how it stretches out along a particular river or canyon or street, we must keep the neighborhood together first before we consider compactness. The law also prohibits favoring or discriminating against political parties. Partisan data is not a factor that can be considered as part of this process. Finally, in the third column, other traditional districting principles. These are factors that the courts have recognized as being valid to consider in the redistricting process. This does not mean that you have to consider them, and part of the conversation can be on the extent to which any of them are considered. Also, in the Fair Maps Act, these can only be considered after we've looked at federal and state law. So we want to think about these other traditional districting principles as being valid, but they're certainly last or at the bottom of our priority list. For example, future population growth. As I'll talk about over the next couple of slides, even a project or small development can have a big impact in a city the size of Los Alamitos. And so we might want to consider if we know or if we believe there may be growth coming to different parts of the city over the next decade. Similarly, we might want to consider respecting the voters' choices, the idea that the voters of the city elected a council and it should be up to the voters to decide whether members continue, not the stroke of a pen on the map. Also, minimizing voters shifted to different election years is the idea that, some voters last had an election for council in 2018. Putting them in a district that next elects in 2024 could unduly delay representation for voters who go 6 years with that representation. Now, like I said, all of these traditional districting principles are things that are valid, but only after we've considered federal and state law in that order. To talk a little bit more about neighborhoods. Now, the city actually has some very well-defined neighborhoods throughout the community. And so when we talk about neighborhoods, normally we talk about subdivisions or areas that have a historical or a geographic or physical link. We do have a map from the general plan that shows about 17 or 18 different neighborhoods throughout the city. In addition, there are some population in areas not in neighborhoods. For example, there are about 30 residents in the census block where the hospital is. That not in a specific neighborhood, but they do count toward the purpose of representation. And so these are the kinds of things we want to look at neighborhoods. Place areas like Old Town and Apartment Row, Carrier Row and Old Dutch Haven. Places that have those identities because of their development, because of their planning, or simply because the city has designated that as an area. Communities of interest are how we connect neighborhoods together. So it's not just about that shared history, shared planning, but it's about the shared issues, characteristics, impacts, problems that unite or link different communities or neighborhoods across the city. We really want to think particularly certain communities, and I'll call out Apartment Row, are bigger than a district. Apartment Row will have to be divided in order to balance the population. So what are the natural ways of doing that? How do we think about communities, particularly when we're talking about fairly small districts? And this is going to be a real potential challenge because if we look at our current district map, the total deviation, the total difference in population between the largest and smallest is at 21.5%. This is really driven, if we look at the numbers, by District 3. Now, the actual raw numbers are not that big. In most cities, a deviation of 385 people would be insignificant. But in a city of just under 11,800, that is a really substantial number. So even one new apartment building, even one new development with maybe 80 or 90 homes, or even fewer than that, I should say, even 20 or 30 homes, could have a significant impact on the city's population equality. Now, Area 3 is the one that is the most overpopulated at 16% over. Areas 2, 4, and 5 are each about 5% underpopulated. And Area 1 is right about 1.5% underpopulated. This means that District 3 will need to lose population at the very minimum, and that 2, 4, and 5 will need to gain population at a minimum. This, of course, also could be an invitation to look at all aspects of the map if you choose to do so. Given our population, each of the 5 council districts needs to contain about 2,360 people. Looking at the Voting Rights Act analysis here, we do see there is a small concentration of Latinos in the west end of the city, in Old Town West in particular, is where we see a concentration of Latino community. It's an area that we would probably look not to divide if at all possible. We can see that because the areas that are in purple and blue are, under 35% Latino. The areas in green and yellow are between 50 and 75% Latino by eligible voters. Looking at the Asian American community, we do see a concentration of Asian Americans, a smaller concentration, but one nonetheless, in the north end of District 2, particularly in the north of Cerritos, in the far northern part of the city is where we see the biggest concentration. In addition to race and ethnicity, we also look at a variety of demographic measures. For example, where do we find apartments and multifamily housing? We see a fairly stark divide. Most of the city is under 25% apartments, but apartment row, of course, is over 65%. We see a lot more mixed across the city when it comes to measures like income or education, where we see that there are blocks or areas with very high levels of income or education next to blocks with lower levels side by side throughout the city. In addition, I mentioned that neighborhood map. This is taken from the general plan. It has 16 communities on it. Not all the population in the city is in these 16 communities. As I mentioned, there's population counted at the hospital and actually on the military base and elsewhere throughout the city. And so to that point, as part of this process, we really want to welcome however you want to submit maps to us, whoever you want to get us your feedback or comments. We're happy to take it. What we're looking at doing is preparing a variety of different tools aimed at different audiences. So for example, if somebody wants a simple paper map that simply shows the different neighborhoods or areas of the city with their current populations, we've, working on putting together a one-page document that has all the different populations of the different neighborhoods or communities and which council district they're currently in. That would allow people to build their own map just by adding the numbers together using a calculator, maybe on their phone. In addition, we have a couple of browser-based tools. Dave's Redistricting is sort of, I call it the paint the map tool. It's very intuitive to use. You just sign up for an account. You can start with either the current council districts or with a blank map of the city. And what you can do is, just simply using your browser, paint the areas, the color that you want to assign them to, calculate the population as you go. We also are working on, and haven't heard back from our vendor, but we've submitted the request for the Maptitude online redistricting tool that really gives you all of the data and the real power to go block by block, building your district map. And that hopefully will be coming later this week. I believe it should be coming later this week. All of these tools will be posted on the city's website under the Draw Map section of the redistricting website, and all will be available throughout the process. So, I know we have some deadlines for council consideration at some of the earlier hearings, but the tools will remain active and online throughout the entire process. And in addition, we also will have an interactive web viewer with that data supporting it so that people can, if you just want to view the data, it's available for you to view and download. And so that really brings me to our conversation today for the public hearing. What are the neighborhoods in their boundaries that we need to take into account as part of this process? And are there any questions about the mapping tool or the process as we move forward? So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to our conversation tonight.
Thank you, Justin. This is a public hearing. So Wendy, do we have any comments from the public?
We did not receive any written comments, and I do not show that there are any members of the public currently participating on the phone call.
Okay, so I'll bring it back to council. I'm going to go first because I can. So you talked about future neighborhoods and how they would impact us. We've got two neighborhoods, one that's coming online now, which is the 50 townhomes and then the 110 luxury apartments. I think that's in District 2. It's over by Oak Middle School. District 1?
Phase 1.
Okay, so that's substantial. And then also whatever's going to happen with this West Ed over by Parkwood, that's also going to affect us. So how do we guess, because obviously they're not voters now, but they will be. Does that, because I could see where that could hurt, like District 1, where we take away voters now to anticipate future voters, but then right now that's lopsided. How does that work?
Sure. So we do have to stay within the 10% deviation according to the 2020 census numbers. So whatever we take into account with future growth, we still have to stay under 10% at the end of the day. However, and I definitely have seen the townhomes come online, and I think that what we want to do is make sure to perhaps slightly underpopulate districts 1 and 5 in that case, to make sure that we anticipate some of that growth. If we know that there's going to be an area of the city that's less likely to have growth over the next 10 years, then we can slightly overpopulate that. Maybe we're talking about 1 or 2%, over or under, not up to, maybe, not full 5% in either direction. But this is why we look at this every 10 years. And when we look at the 2030 numbers, they might show something very different.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Back to my colleagues. Does anybody have any questions, comments?
Shelley.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Shelley, your comment was very similar to mine. So we have to base it on the 2020 population figures with the 10%, even though we recognize that down in the Parkwood area, with the new development down there, the population down there is going to increase over the next 10 years. And then in District 1, with all the new apartments just south of Cerritos there near the high school, that district is going to increase pretty dramatically. So I would say probably by the time of this next election, we'll already be out of balance in terms of the 10%. So I guess my question is there anything we can do to try to address that ahead of time so we don't get so out of balance, or are we just going to have to base it on that 10% margin that we have to work with?
We do have to base it on the 10% margin, but we can, underpopulate those districts that we know are going to grow more and overpopulate those we think might grow less. Now, if we think we have projects coming up in every district, it's possible that they balance each other out at the end of the day. But if we know that, there are specific projects, this location and that location, we can look at those locations and underpopulate the district that contains that location.
Yeah, I would guess we can pretty well anticipate a lot of that information right now. So I guess what I'm saying, it looks to me like that you're going to have to underpopulate 1 and 5, and that if 3, did you say, is already overpopulated? So it looks like we're going to have to pick up some more area in districts 2 and 4.
That's right. And District 3 is the one that's going to have to lose the most. And that's the effect of one new apartment building coming online in the city.
Right.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, as the District 1 hero, I can assure you all that I will gladly share some of the multifamily units and take on someone else's single family homes, because that is actually a disadvantage to being in District 1. You are almost assuredly going to live in a multifamily unit because there are 2 streets that have houses, and they're in I call it the unicorn land. It's Long Beach, LaSalle, Lily and Marna. There's like 8 or 9 addresses on each street, and that's it. So yes, let's trade. Can we? How does it work? Do I barter? Do I go to George? Let's make a deal.
All right. Anybody else? All right. So with that, this is just we don't need to vote on anything. This was just more of an informative public hearing. Okay. So with that, I'll go ahead and adjourn this meeting. We've got 4 minutes. Spend it wisely, and we'll be back for our regular council meeting.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.